So in my last How I Got Diamond video, I teased that the next champion I was one-tricking Diamond was Diana. 117 days, 184 Diana games, and a 56.5% win rate later, I finally hit Diamond on Diana. Climbing on Diana was quite a different experience than Tryndamere. For one, she doesn't break many rules of the game like Tryndamere. You have to be a fundamentally good player in order to still climb with her. She is still quite a strong champion, and by prioritizing the right skills, you can churn out some serious OP games if you invest some time into it. So let's get right into it. Why should you play Diana? One of the main reasons why I recommend Diana is because of her combination of simplicity plus agency. The more I play League, the more I'm convinced that this is the formula for rank success. Get yourself an easy to play champion that can reliably exert their will onto the game, and you will be able to have more influence in those close games that come down to the wire. And in the span of a week where you played about 10 games, that's the difference between going 5-5 and 7-3. By taking control of the game with her engaged capabilities, you can single-handedly win teamfights. And speaking of taking control of the game, the second reason why I'd recommend Diana is her extremely strong early game. Although she's a melee champion, her Q range and wave clear along with their high base stats make her a frightening skirmisher in the early to mid game. Once you get better at landing your Q, you can reliably set up for solo kills within the first 2 to 3 levels, especially with Ignite and Scorch setup. Her relative tankiness in the early game is also crucial for winning those pivotal early game 2v2 skirmishes that can set the pace for the rest of the game. One of the things I love about Diana that not a lot of other champions have is that she is a beginner friendly champion but also has the capacity to really shut down the opposition if you put some games into her. She can get you out of bronze and silver with the simplicity of her kit, but can also get you out of platinum and emerald with her ability to influence the map early and often. Those champions are not as common as you think. Lastly, and certainly not least, is her crazy versatility. Diana can flex into 3 roles and can have up to 4 modes depending on what kind of setup you decide to take. I can't stress how valuable this is for climbing solo queue, especially for one-tricking. Take a champion like Talia for instance. Technically, she's a pentaflex champion that can go in any lane and function perfectly fine. However, she only has one mode. She's a backline mage disruptor champion with a global for making plays. The beautiful thing about Diana is that you can drastically change her output by taking different setups, and this can seriously catch your opponents off guard if they are expecting the traditional assassin or even bruiser style. Having a champion that can readily adapt to the game as it develops and have the ability to build a wide array of different items is incredibly useful. So let's get right into it. What exactly are these builds and how do you use them properly? There are 4 permutations of Diana that can have drastically different outputs within the game. Those 4 are Assassin, Bruiser, Tank, and Splitpush. Before I get into Diana's modes, let me give you a quick rundown of what Diana's runes and summoners are because they are very crucial to understanding her different modes. Diana can choose between Ignite and TP for her summoners and between Electrocute, Phase Rush, Conqueror, and Grasp for keystone runes. Let me get Conqueror out of the way first. This setup is typically used in the jungle, but it can also be used top as well. It's usually good for Bruiser and Tank playstyles, but I've seen Assassin build work with it too. Diana can get max stacks on Conqueror pretty quickly from her kit, and the healing makes her a formidable threat in sustained fights. Now moving on to Grasp. This rune setup is mostly used for top, although it can be used for mid into melee matchups. The health you get from Grasp procs can lend itself nicely in a tank or bruiser setup and can synergize nicely with items that benefits off of bonus health ratios. One thing to note is that with Grasp, you've essentially identified that you are not the main win condition in Champ Select, and you will be supplementing your team with much needed beefiness and PO to help win the game. Now, with those 2 out of the way, let's get into the big 2 you'll be running for most of your games. First is Electrocute. This is a standard setup for Assassin Diana, which is what I played for about 70% of my games. Its ability to get good short trades off is crucial for snowballing in the early game and can create some serious one-shot thresholds in the mid game when compounded with other AP assassin items. You can augment this rune by also running Ignite as your summoner, which will give you extreme early game agency and the ability to snowball in most matchups. Ignite plus Electrocute was my most common setup as it helped me close out solo kills and set myself up nicely for the mid game. As I matured as a Diana player and learned her limits better, I stopped relying on Ignite for solo kills and started taking TP. TP scales much better than Ignite and gives you a lot of versatility in terms of map movements that can set up for pivotal mid-game teamfights. Teleport plus Electrocute is what you should eventually graduate into as an Assassin Diana player, keeping your burst ahead of the curve without having to sacrifice map mobility in the process. Lastly, we have Phase Rush. Now, Phase Rush is quite unique in the sense that it's the only keystone that is always viable. No matter what mode of Diana you're trying to play, you will literally never go wrong with Phase Rush. That being said, it's important to understand the pros and cons of taking this rune because while it's super versatile, there can be times where it's not necessarily the most optimal. So initially, I used Phase Rush at the very start of my Diana journey and I found it quite underwhelming in terms of playing as an assassin. The speed you get provides a lot of utility in escaping ganks or keeping up with targets, but I couldn't take advantage of Diana's early game power with it. However, I found Phase Rush's true calling when I ran into tough matchups like Irelia, Anivia, Akali, and sometimes even Yone. Against champions that have a lot of DPS and or just naturally countered your kit, I found that taking Phase Rush to run away served me quite nicely. I was able to lose lane gracefully while still getting to my items and becoming a threat in the mid game. As such, I would generally recommend using this in matchups where you know you won't be able to achieve an early game lead for whatever reason, or if you're countered by the enemy comp altogether. Let's talk a bit more about Assassin Diana. We've covered rune choices for Assassin setup already, but let's finish off this topic by discussing her build. For Assassin, I usually run Storm Surge, Lichbane, Zhonya with Sork's Rush. This setup gives you phenomenal early game damage with Sork's Alternator Rush and the ability to off any target that you set your eyes on. Early game is quite important for this mode, as that's how you will be able to garner the leads to snowball out of control in the mid game. Make sure you freeze the wave in the first 2 to 6 minutes so you can give yourself a better chance to run down your enemy opponent and get an advantage. However, don't beat yourself up if you can't establish leads in the early game. She scales just fine until 2 to 3 items, so make sure you're not dropping waves and or roaming too much. On the subject of roaming, make sure to push out your wave before roaming and ideally roam on a cannon wave, as that gives you more time to make a play and get back to the lane before your opponent can react. Diana also has good wave clear, so it makes it easy to push out the wave and roam. As Assassin Diana, you are supposed to play around pockets of vision. Invest in sweepers and red wards after laning phase to create pockets of darkness. For this mode of Diana, playing around neutral objectives is absolutely crucial. Always keep track of when the next neutral objective is coming up, and decide beforehand if you want to contest it or give it up. Ult is extremely important for this style of Diana, so make sure you don't waste it before a big objective fight. When going in, make sure to wait out key cooldowns, as you are liable to getting chain CC'd and dying if you get too trigger happy. Save your ult for after enemies use their key movement abilities. One of the most annoying things to Diana is for your targets to flash away from the ult damage. If the enemy is too tanky and I can't find a reason to build Assassin, I usually default to Bruiser Diana. The setup for this mode is Nashor, Riftmaker, Liandry's, and you can round it out with Crypt Bloom and Cosmic Drive. I typically get Phase Rush for the setup, but Grasp and Conqueror pages can work in melee matchups in both mid and top. Bruiser Diana can play in 2 ways. Either you're a diver that creates space for your carries by keeping the enemy busy, or you're a peeler who CCs enemies with your ult to keep your carries safe. Both styles are viable, and it's up to you to decide what exactly you need to be doing with this build. With Diana's 3-hit passive, she benefits a lot off of Nashor and Riftmaker to output some serious sustained damage, and her tankiness can catch a lot of people off guard. If the enemy team's damage spread is too skewed one way or another, items like Force of Nature and Frozen Heart can also be good after a damage item. This build is a little bit more team reliant, so make sure to keep a mental note of where your teammates are, and especially where your carries are when you play. Tank Diana is basically just a follow-up on Bruiser Diana. There's not much that changes from this build to the last, it's just that you're even more team reliant and you deal even less damage. This build is good for when there is no assassination targets, you're hard countered, and you're losing the early game. Building stuff like Roa, Locket, and Knight's Vow is good here, and you are solely focused on your team to deal damage and carry you to the win. Diana can still do decent damage with the setup, especially with Grasp or Phase Rush, but this isn't the most optimal build, and you shouldn't be going into games looking to build it either. It's more of a follow-up option when you're getting your ass beat. Lastly, let's finish up with Splitpush Diana. Maybe it's because I previously got Diamond with Trinity Mid, but I managed to find a way to shoehorn Hullbreaker into a Diana build. Now, there are 2 conditions that have to be met before you build this, so start off with the Lichbane as a generic good first item that is also functional in a split push scenario. You have to know that you can beat enemy side laners, or you have to have at least 3 to 4 grubs. Alternatively, you can also decide off of champ select. I know a game is going to be split push when I see enemy champions like Janna, Taric, and Shen. These kinds of champions specialize in countering Diana, so you have to get yourself away from the team fight altogether. Use your early power and communicate to your jungler that you'll be useless this game without grubs to split. Secure grubs and play a relatively clean early game. Your main objective in these games is to get to the side lanes, ideally opposite to the objective that's going to be fought over, and split push down the turrets while everyone else is team fighting. The build here is Lichbane, Nashor's, and Hullbreaker. I usually run Phase Rush when I'm going to split push because it gives me the safety in the early game where I'm biding time to split, and allows me to run away from potentially sticky situations while I'm being collapsed on during the split push. This style is also viable if you were looking to build Assassin and end up getting shit on early. If you have enough grubs, you can always pivot into Nashor's and Hullbreaker and perma side lane. It's better than you grouping and being absolutely useless to your team. I've won about 3 to 5 games in my climb where I consciously made the decision to pivot into a split push build and annoy the enemy team enough to sneak away the Nexus. Think about that for a second. 3 to 5 games is about 66 to 110 LP. It's the difference between staying in E290 LP or getting diamond. While it's a very niche build, it can seriously have its upside, especially with the introduction of grubs, so take advantage of it when you can. I'll leave you guys with some tips and tricks that I wish I knew at the start of my journey that are going to seriously accelerate your Diana journey through the ranks. Number 1, once you go in, you almost always don't have a way out. This is very important for you to internalize, especially when you're doing your due diligence in the early game and getting fed. I've lost about 8 to 9 games in where I was just tunneled on engaging the team fight and simply just lost the game for my team. Being trigger happy is a double-sided sword for Diana. It's something that you can only master by playing and failing a lot on the champion. On one side, being decisive allows you to make good plays that the ops aren't necessarily prepared for, allowing you to overwhelm them with your damage and snowball even further towards the win. However, on the other side, and more often than not, it leads into a complete int, where you're throwing away your massive bounty, and all the momentum you've been building up for the entire game is completely lost. You can screw up a perfectly played game with one bad engage, especially when you are the main win condition. There are at least 10 games where I started off 5-0, 7-0, 9-0, and lost because I wasn't playing patient enough and holding my engage before going in. Remember, unlike a ranged character, you have to endanger your body and bounty to get your damage up, so make sure you're aware enough of where everyone is and what the conditions are going into a fight so you can get your damage off without dying. This is the main thing that helped me back from getting diamond sooner. There were so many damn games I threw because I got drunk off my own power and fed away my bounty, which eventually led to a snowball from the enemy team. Please don't make the same mistake I did. It will save you loads of time. Number 2, play around neutral objectives. I'm eventually going to make a video on the importance of planning your plays around neutral objectives, but for now, let's just say that this is the holy grail of playing Diana. Everything you do is building towards an inevitable fight at a neutral objective. Even if you're running split push, your whole prerogative is to get into the side lane before the objective can spawn to apply pressure. Train yourself to have a mental note of the next neutral objective, whether you can get an item spike before it spawns and whether you're going to contest it. Neutral objectives are a great opportunity for people to gather around in comps, which is exactly what you want for your ultimate. Number 3, invest heavily in improving Q accuracy. Diana's Q is her bread and butter ability and the most important ability to learn properly within your journey. At the very start of the laning phase, hitting Qs often can seriously start chunking out your enemy laner, especially if you are running Scorch. It can set up solo kills early and often. Visualize your Q as a right hook. It helps line up the ability better because of its non-linear travel path, allowing you to hit only the targets you want. Remembering that it comes from a right side will better help you tune whether to go for a long Q or cut it short. Post-laning phase, Q is the ability that sets up the rest of your combo. It is vital that you hit your Q on your target so you can follow them up with a second dash if they try and run away. Missing your Q can be disastrous here. So how good is Diana for one-tricking? I've broken her down into 3 parts: difficulty, power, and availability. The first thing to look at is how easy she is. This is further broken down into 2 parts: ease of learning and ease of execution. For ease of learning, she gets a 6 out of 10. Diana is typically played as an assassin, and the assassin playbook can be a bit overwhelming for some players, especially for a champion that doesn't have a way out once she goes in. There are additional skills to be learned that some assassins like Zed don't need to. For ease of execution, she gets a 9.5 out of 10. She's very easy to execute mechanically, and her kit is pretty straightforward, and there is very few mechanical deviations. Next, let's look at power, and this is also broken down into 2 further parts: how powerful she is when ahead, and how useful she is when she's behind. For power when ahead, I've given her a 7 out of 10. She has deadly snowball potential and can get out of control pretty quickly, but one misstep and you can lose all the momentum you've built up. For usefulness when behind, I've given her a 3 out of 10. Diana doesn't really have a good fallback pattern. It's either build tanky or split push. When you're building tanky, you're at the mercy of your team, and split pushing isn't always possible every game. Last is availability. This is how likely we are to get our champ. Keep in mind that I'm assuming we're one-tricking here, and we should at least be picking our champ within the first 3 slots. For availability, I've given her a 4.5 out of 5. There's a decent chance you'll get her more often than not. The fact that she can play 3 positions, including a commonly auto-filled one, is a major plus here. That's 30 out of 50, so for a total out of 100, she gets a 60, landing her in A tier. Diana overall is an extremely easy champion with decent to good power and great versatility. So now that I've convinced you to one-trick Diana, what should you be looking for in order to climb with her? Let me break it down for you. Now, if you're below Silver 2, I'd actually recommend not picking up Diana at all. Now, y'all might be confused with this one. If Diana is such an easy champion, surely she's good for playing in lower elos, right? Well, yes, but also no. Diana is easy mechanically speaking. She doesn't need Kalista level APM or Kiana level combos to be functional. She's pretty straightforward in her execution. The reason why I don't recommend picking her up, however, is that she falls off after 3 items. In lower elos, games tend to go longer because people don't know how to close a game out with an advantage. That's why you see scaling champions generally do well in lower elos. While Diana is fine onto 3 items, she starts to taper off as people start to group more and build defensive items. Her damage starts to mean less and less. Even if you've played correctly and snowballed, it is meaningless if your team doesn't always group for objectives or gets caught out randomly and drags the game longer than it should. Diana doesn't work in lower elos, not because people can't pilot her, because lower elo players don't know how to play with her on their team. From silver 2 to about gold 3, I'd recommend you to stay on top of your farm. Diana is a champion that plays hard and fast, constantly looking for picks and assassinations. In this style of play, it is easy to get caught up in all of the cool assassinations and forget to keep your farm ahead of the curve. Be sure to shove waves before you roam. Be sure to catch waves before you group. This is an extremely important skill that I want people in this elo bracket to learn early, because it will serve you well for the rest of your league career. If you're confident with your farming and you're around gold 3 to plat 4, I suggest you work on your matchup understanding. In this rank, I want people to really delve into the details of Diana's matchups and practice how to get a lead in each matchup. This is where you might want to start running Ignite and really be trying to force the issue early and often. Learning how to generate your own leads is very important to your ability to consistently influence games. With farming and laning out of the way, I want all players in Platinum to learn how to cheese effectively with Diana. Now, this applies more for Assassin than it does for Bruiser or Tank, but it's an important skill for translating your leads correctly. Even if you're 5-0 in the first 15 minutes, if you aren't switching to sweepers and red wards and camping bushes, you aren't using her power properly. It is worth reiterating that Diana has somewhat of a limited window of power before she starts to get overtaken by some champions. Use Vision Denial as a means to capitalize on your power spike and decisively close out the game. For players in Emerald 4 to Emerald 3, I recommend playing with your strongest teammate. At this elo, people are generally aware of your damage capacity and will be wary of dark spots in the map. Since they won't give up free kills as easily, you need to identify who is your strongest teammate that game and start coordinating plays around them. Diana isn't necessarily a 1v9 champion, and the higher you go, the more you need to rely on your teammates to either set you up with CC or dive in with you to create mayhem. And lastly, for Emerald 2 to Diamond 4, the most important skill to brush up on is early game skirmishing. Anyone who's been in this elo knows how fights break out all over the place in the first 13 minutes, and as Diana, you are in prime position to capitalize off this. Always have your map awareness focus and track your jungler's movements across the map. You need to be ready to shove the wave and roam to help them at a moment's notice. In conclusion, Diana is a champion that I recommend playing for everybody. She is a triple flex champion that has different modes of output depending on the game state. She is fun to play, simplistic, and can get shit done herself without needing teammates most of the time. While she isn't as strong as Tryndamere in terms of raw power or the ability to warp a game, playing Diana will teach you more about the fundamentals of the game that can allow you to pick up other champions much easier, as well as understand the game more intuitively on a deeper scale. The next champion for my Unranked to Diamond series is going to be Yone. Look forward to it.